Hey everybody, this is Andy Bennett with the CSS News Civil War Interpretive Center. Today we're at Governor Charles B. Aycock birthplace. The structure behind me is interpreted as a pantry. So in those previous videos when we talked about drying, pickling, fermentation, and canning, this is the type of structure we would store those items in on the farm in the 19th century. But today we're not talking about that. We're going to talk about some of the structural changes we need to make to this structure to help us preserve dairy products. But let's get to the science of how to preserve milk into those dairy products. We're all familiar with milk, butter, and cheese. Those processes to take that milk and make it into butter and cheese are fairly simple processes. What we're doing in making butter is we're taking whole milk and we're trying to separate out the milk solids that will become the butter and the liquid that will become buttermilk. And what we're doing is mechanically separating. Through churning, we are mechanically separating the liquid from the solid. Once we get that liquid out of there, it makes it easier and more stable. Like I said before, drying is the simplest process. We're back to that drying. We're helping dry out that product by removing some of the moisture and condensing the fats, right, in the milk solids. It makes it less likely to spoil, but it still needs to have to fit in a narrow range of temperature. We want to really keep milk and dairy products between 35 degrees and no more than about 40 degrees. Now, that's going to be difficult to do here in North Carolina, but we can get really close. One of the other ways to separate the milk solids and the liquid is making cheese. And how we're going to do this is chemically. We're going to take our whole milk, we're going to have it rennet. Rennet is an enzyme that's found in calf stomachs. By adding that to our whole milk, interacting with lactic acid, it's going to separate into curds and whey. You've probably heard that curds and whey before. The whey, we're going to take that off to the side, and we're not going to throw that out just like we don't throw away buttermilk. We're going to take that whey and we can use it to make other things, but we're going to concentrate on those curds. The curds, we're going to try to squeeze as much water out of it. We're drying. We're trying to squeeze as much water out of it, and we're going to add salt to it. Salt's going to help drive out some of that moisture, right? Depending on what kind of cheese we're trying to make, how much of this process we're going to do. If we have a bunch of milk and we want to convert some of it in fast, quick, simpler ways where we don't remove as much moisture is to make like cottage cheese or farmer's cheese or to make yogurt. But making hard cheeses, some of those, we're going to enlist the help of some of those beneficial bacteria we've talked about in the past. Think about it. Swiss cheese, the holes in Swiss cheese come from gas pockets created by a bacteria added to that cheese. Blue cheese, that is a form of mold added to that cheese that brings a distinctive flavor in that color. No matter where you travel in the world, they make cheese differently, and there's hundreds of different styles of cheeses, but they're basically drying that cheese out. Adding salt creates a rind on it, that protective layer, just like curing meat. We have a protective salty layer that provides a protective layer to protect the cheese, right? So we've got our milk, we've got our butter, we've got our cheese. Now we got to make sure we keep the insects and animals like rodents out of it, so we need to store it somewhere, and we also need to try to keep it as cool as possible. One of the things is a milk house. We could take and create louvers on sides of this pantry building, and then inside we could store our crocks of milk. As condensation forms on the crocks and containers, the wind would blow through the louvers, blowing across those crocks, creating evaporation and cooling down the contents of those crocks, right? If we didn't have a dairy house, where several other things we could use, but let me mention, if you were interested in dairy houses, Somerset, one of our state historic sites, has a beautiful dairy house out there at their site, so go check out the beautiful craftsmanship of that. If you are in the Durham area, Bennett Place has just a newly reconstructed dairy house there that you can check out. But if you don't, wherever you are across our state historic sites, there are dairy houses at various sites. So go check that out. They're on different designs. They come in all shapes and sizes. Some of the other ways we could help preserve these dairy products is a spring house. So we're looking to have a nice, cool spring bubbling water up through that cold water, we could create a foundation to catch that water. In there, we would build a shelf where the water would cool water run through. We would set our crocks of dairy products down in. As the cool water runs across it, it cools those down. We build a structure over it to keep the animals and the bugs out in their spring house. We have a wonderful spring house at Vance Birthplace in the mountains. So if you're near there, or drop by and check that out. One of the other ways is probably the way that the Acox preserved their dairy products. When they dug their well, they would create a shelf, and that shelf would be right where the water would sit. So you could lower your bottles of milk and lower your crocks of dairy products using a well sweep, the giant crane arm that you see at our state historic sites near our wells. You would lower those products down. If you didn't have that, of course, a rope. You would lower those products down onto that shelf. They would sit in that water, and through the same process of heat exchange through the crock and the water, they would help cool them down. Now, these are getting them down in temperature, cooler than the outside heat, but not cool enough. In eastern North Carolina, a well dug down to 30 feet, the water is going to stay about 67 degrees. If you go into the mountains or into the foothills of North Carolina, more about 65 degrees. It's going to depend on the time of year, outside temperature, how low we can get that temperature down. But most of the time, we're not going to hit that threshold for very long. So those dairy products, the milk and the butter, need to be used as quickly as possible. The cheese, since we put it through that drying process and preservation process, is going to last a little bit longer. If you're enjoying these videos, you're learning something about food preservation. I enjoy bringing them to you. I encourage you to go out to our other state historic sites and check out what they call outbuildings, the buildings that are not the house, because they tell some interesting stories about daily life of the people who lived in North Carolina. Please join us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram for all of our videos at the CSS Neuse Civil War Interpretive Center.